And Mr. President, as public awareness of our bipartisan disapproval resolution grows in the days ahead, I expect that there will be many more statements that will be issued in support of its passage. And while there is an extremely vocal minority that does not support it, I do hope that my Senate colleagues will look at the broad coalition that does and join us to oppose the EPA's regulations. Now, before I wrap up, Mr. President, I'd also like to address the criticisms and arguments that have been made by those who oppose my efforts. And I'd like to address 4 of the latest claims in hopes of putting them to rest. First of all, I would like to reiterate that our bipartisan disapproval resolution deals with the EPA's current interpretation of the Clean Air Act and has nothing to do with the science of global climate change. And I would also remind my critics that I co-sponsored a cap-and-trade bill in the last Congress, and last year worked with the members of the Senate Energy Committee to craft a bipartisan clean energy bill. And that bill, unfortunately, has been languishing on the Senate calendar for nearly 8 months now, just waiting to be called up and considered, which I think is a real shame because it would lead to significant emissions reductions and greater energy security for our country. Now, I'd also like to address a rather creative claim that has been made that somehow I'm attempting to gut the Clean Air Act or subvert it into a Dirty Air Act. And I have to admit that when I first saw this, it actually made me laugh because it is so wildly inaccurate. Neither my previous amendment nor this resolution would have any effect on pollution standards and controls. Neither would change a single word of the current statute. My resolution would simply prevent the massive, unwarranted expansion of this statute by halting EPA's efforts to use it to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, a purpose for which it was never intended and a role that it simply cannot fulfill without serious and detrimental consequences. Now, it's also been stated that this resolution will somehow prevent Congress from working constructively on climate legislation this year. Not the case. My resolution will restrain the EPA's ability to issue greenhouse gas regulations, but it will have absolutely no bearing on Congress's ability to debate climate policy. It's especially ironic that these comments were made by the senator who has complete control of the Senate calendar. So if climate legislation does not come up this year, it's abundantly clear to me who will have made that decision. Now, the last claim that I would like to address are the allegations about who helped draft my September amendment, which I might remind colleagues was never offered and is no longer on the table. Not only are those allegations categorically false, but they highlight the unwillingness of opponents to this measure to engage in the real policy discussion that we should be having. The question that so many of the individuals and the groups opposed to my efforts have failed entirely to answer is if they honestly think that the EPA climate regulations under the Clean Air Act would be good or bad for America. Now, I hope, Mr. President, that the debate over this resolution will stay rooted in the substance. There's plenty of substance for us to debate. There is a legitimate and a substantive debate to be had about whether or not the EPA should be allowed to issue these regulations before Congress has had an opportunity to fully debate the issue of climate change. In my mind, the answer is no. Congress must be given the time that it needs to develop a responsible policy that protects both the environment and the economy. We are not incapable or even unwilling to legislate on this topic. So far, this Congress has merely failed to develop a balanced measure that draws enough support to be signed into law. And we can remedy that shortcoming, and I remain committed to playing a constructive role in that effort. I believe that the looming specter of EPA regulations is actually a big part of the reason that we've had difficulty moving forward on climate legislation. Even though we know that some approaches for reducing emissions are greatly inferior to others, there's inexplicable resistance to removing even our worst option from consideration. Mr. President, I haven't heard one member say that he or she prefers regulation over legislation. I haven't heard one member say that. And yet, that option is not only still around, but it's also closer than ever to becoming reality. And as long as it remains out there, it will be Plan B for those who wish to address climate change at any cost. And if this issue has become so politicized that some members would support EPA regulation instead of a legislative effort aimed at passing a bipartisan bill, that would not only be a tragedy for our constituents, but I believe also a sad day for us in the Senate. If we're serious about fulfilling our duty to our constituents and giving this issue the full debate that it deserves, we should take the EPA regulations off the table. Without a backstop that says emissions will be reduced one way or another, no matter how painful, supporters of climate legislation would have to get serious about finding common ground and bipartisan co-sponsors. Major environmental legislation such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act all faced opposition at the outset, and that's no secret or surprise. But members worked together to resolve the concerns instead of threatening to take a different or a more damaging course. As Senator Ed Muskie would later write, the Clean Air Act, quote, was passed unanimously after just 2 days on the floor, which prompted Senator Eugene McCarthy to remark that he'd finally found an issue better than motherhood, and some people are even against motherhood. The Clean Water Act passed by a vote of 86-0, and the Safe Water Drinking Act didn't even require a roll call vote. It was passed by voice vote. Mr. President, the Senate has a history of coming together to overwhelmingly support common sense environmental legislation. But today, however, as we seek the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're being presented with a false choice between unacceptable legislation and unacceptable regulations. We're being told, threatened really, to pass a bill now or the economy will suffer. A number of senators are trying to develop bills that can be signed into law, but even as that work continues, the EPA's endangerment finding has opened the door to further economic damage. I believe that Congress must take that option off the table, and we can do that by approving the bipartisan disapproval resolution that 39 senators have now introduced. Allowing the EPA to proceed will endanger jobs and our economy and our global competitiveness. And that should be an outcome that we can all agree to avoid. If you truly believe that EPA climate regulations are good for the country, then you vote to oppose our resolution. But if you share our concerns and you believe that climate policy should be debated here in Congress, then vote with us to support it. With that, Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor.